Hello, my name is Isaac Barker, also known as Izzy Pro Dizzy on stage. How y'all doing? Blessings, good day. I wrote a research paper trying to change the world. It's very important information that I found out through medical institutions, government archives, and it's very, very pertinent information, and it's very heartbreaking information as well. The name of my paper is, If Not Reparations, How Can You Repair the Black Nation? Let's begin. For many people in the United States, the problems facing African Americans seem invisible, irrelevant, or make-believe. Many Americans, immigrants, and people of the world believe that African Americans have been completely in control of their fate since Lincoln ended slavery and somewhat responsible for their lives in the ghetto. The Association for Psychological Science tells us, studies have shown that white people often cloak or deny their privileged position by, for example, underestimating their advantages in wealth and employment. This adds to an already gloomy situation African Americans face, making it worse. Nikita Stewart stated less than 4 months ago for the New York Times, in most teachings, slavery is treated like a dot on the timeline. Stewart claims researchers found, at best, textbooks maybe have 20 pages about slavery, and that's in an 800-page textbook. The history of black struggles before and after the Civil War is extremely underrepresented. If a person does not know of the black struggles in this country and how racial disparities started, that person does not know how American freedom, liberty, and justice for all really came to be. Black rights struggles paved the way, and I quote, "Black rights struggles paved the way for every other rights struggles, including women's and gay rights, immigrants and disability rights," as so gloriously stated by Nicole Hannah-Jones in her piece for the New York Times. If black people didn't fight and struggle under a brutal system of discrimination, I don't know what kind of society we would be living in today. Both of these articles and more throughout this paper are from the New York Times, from their 1619 project. The 1619 project is a major initiative from the New York Times observing the 400th anniversary of the beginning of American slavery. It aims to reframe the country's history, understanding that 1619 is our true founding and placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of black Americans at the very center of the story we tell ourselves about who we are. Being Americans, we must understand who we are and our history, who we are and who we have hurt. Joe Heim says in his article, "The Missing Pieces of America's Education" for the Washington Post, people need to be taught that the modern United States was built on Indian land by African labor. Comparably, our murderously racist history is worse than Germany's history with the Nazi persecution. When we grapple the harsh facts of our history, we come to further understand ourselves and how our country became such a powerful nation. Because of slavery, America was able to break away from the strongest nation in the world and become one of the strongest nations in the world. The wealth and power accorded by our country's founding fathers and the Americans at the time through slavery were of astronomical proportions, unlike anything the world has ever seen. In 1962, James Baldwin wrote in the New Yorker, "Whatever white people do not know about the Negro reveals precisely and inexorably what they do not know about themselves." African Americans were able to acquire over 14 million acres of land between 1865 to 1910. That's basically the size of Maryland, Vermont, and Delaware combined. Why don't they own it now? Very few people know about the many horrible sins and crimes and wicked deeds of Uncle Sam, the KKK, and the good old boys. Divulging the very dark history of the U.S. illuminates the true definition of what America and the average American has been: complacent to a regime of Nazis that have killed and terrorized black people for hundreds of years. I quote, "The American people share collective guilt for the persecution of Negroes just as much as the Germans did for their silence during the Nazi persecution. as stated by Malcolm X as he quoted James Baldwin in a 1963 interview at Berkeley. America's wealth and power have literally been forged with the blood and the strong steel souls of black folk. Truly, quintessential Americans are those who stand up and fight for what's right. Truth, equality, and justice for all. I will no longer sit aiding and abetting these American Nazis. It is time we stand up in an effort to absolve our nation's everlasting collective guilt. The APS states, even subtle, still, structural, and systematic forms of racism continue to lurk in what is becoming an increasingly racially diverse United States. This deep-rooted discrimination affects the lives and serendipity of African Americans every day. It must come to an end. The problems caused by U.S. slavery and the discriminatory laws that follow are severe. Problems such as poor health and living conditions, inadequate education, high incarceration rates, and poverty. These problems and their ailments won't go away if they remain ignored. Finding out how disparities were cultivated through American government policy will raise awareness of the problems that affect us all. Reparations, re-education, and regulations are needed in the fight to diminish the flames of institutionalized racism, flames that have touched and torched millions in this country and around the world. No one is immune to its effects. According to Mimi Kirk in a 2017 article for CityLab, 9 million American children are born in poverty, and most are African American, trapped in a cycle of deprivation. Kirk's article tells us how American poverty is affecting all of us today. 84% of persistently poor children aren't succeeding. While there are costs to these children and their families, there are also costs to society, namely tens of billions of dollars a year lost in productivity and expenses related to poor health and crime. Tens of billions of dollars down the drain every year because of impoverished children, who majority whom are African American, born in a cycle of deprivation. Jim Crow, along with other discriminatory laws, are directly responsible for portions of this loss of economic and human capital. Kirk laments, there shouldn't be millions of children whose probability of success is lowered simply by virtue of being born into certain circumstances. Generation after generation of African Americans will suffer through poverty, and society will suffer the effects because of the government's murderously racist history. The National Community Reinvestment Coalition, or the NCRC, found around 75% of the nation's ghettos that were federally made nearly a century ago still stand today, and still many of them are low-income neighborhoods. The overall infrastructure of these ghettos, such as the streets, hospitals, and schools, are still in desperate need of repair. The NCRC states, and I quote, 74% of the areas that were classified by HOLC, a federal agency, mind you, as hazardous almost 80 years ago are low to moderate income today, and almost 64% of those ghettos are minority-majority communities. This devious process, the classifying as neighborhoods as hazardous, was known as redlining. The discrimination was blatant and commercially practiced by U.S. agencies such as the HOLC and a large number of prejudiced people around the country and in the real estate industry. The NCRC declares tackling economic equality in the 21st century requires grappling with disinvestment in redline neighborhoods so we can address the foundation of segregation and economic inequality visibly evident today. The evidence is plain to see. So when you're driving through an American ghetto, Don't be disgusted at the poverty or the decrepit situation. Be disgusted at the government who created it and now turns a blind eye to the problems they caused. Ghettos and its poor infrastructure filled with innocent, impoverished children are a constant reminder of the desolation caused by American Nazism. 2 years ago in this 2017 article, it states the chances of escaping poverty were only 16%. What were the chances of escaping poverty 60 years ago before the Civil Rights Act? My deductions suggest that chances for black success decline exponentially the further you go in the past. Between 1956 and 1960, only 0.4% of all Americans in the U.S. escaped poverty. As black, white, Asian, European, poor Irish people, Italian folks, everybody who was poor, 0.4%, not even 1% of America escaped poverty between 1956 and 1960. According to the U.S. National Library of Medicine and National Institutes of Health's extensive report called The War on Poverty, Measurements, Trend, and Policy. Government intervention in the form of reparations can significantly lower the number of children born poor in America and instantly diminish the poverty rate right now. African Americans weren't always in the ghettos. The Los Angeles Times in 2001 cried out, "No one knows how many black families have been unfairly stripped of their land, but there are indications of extensive loss." Lewin and Berkeley reported on a 3-part investigation done by the Associated Press. That extensive loss was around 14 million acres. The report entails a long list of many unlawful acts persecuting African Americans between 1910 and 2001. That means within a half a century after slavery, African Americans were able to acquire over 14 million acres of land. That is 21,875 square miles of land, all stolen. That's 18 times the size of Rhode Island alone. Racial terror and violence aided by the government would strip it all away. The investigation found coercion, murder, destruction of legal records, intimidation, and the illegal seizure of land have all led to a 91-year decline in black land ownership in America. This was not the first time blacks were stripped of their land. Did you ever hear about the 40 acres and a mule promised to African Americans? Before the end of the Civil War, President Lincoln and General William T. Sherman from the Union Army passed Special Field Order Number 15, January 16, 1865. The order redistributed 400,000 acres of land from South Carolina to Florida to newly freed blacks in 40-acre segments. These men and women were survivors of absolute living hell. They had to endure the most brutal slavery ever known to mankind. I'd imagine 400,000 acres felt like 1.7 billion square feet of freedom, justice, hope, and a place to finally call home. A place where battered women who've been raped all their life could forget about the horrors of being pimped by their enslavers. Historian Henry Louis Gates Jr. tells us by June 1865, 40,000 freedmen had settled on 400,000 acres in the South. The first official reparations from the U.S. government for slavery. But the order was a short-lived promise for blacks, quoted from the New Georgia Encyclopedia. Nicole Hannah-Jones gives us some reasons why chattel slavery got its most infamous reputation and why blacks basically deserve reparations at the time for slavery. If you didn't know, slavery, U.S. chattel slavery, was the worst slavery known to man. Here's a little excerpt from Nicole Hannah-Jones. Chattel slavery was not conditional, but racial. It was heritable and permanent, not temporary. Meaning generations of black people were born into it and then passed their enslaved status onto their children. Enslaved people were not recognized as human beings, but as property that could be mortgaged, traded, bought and sold, used as collateral, given as a gift, and disposed of violently. We're talking about human beings here. Jefferson's fellow white colonists knew that black people were human beings, but they created a network of laws and customs astounding for both their precision and cruelty. They ensured enslaved people would never be treated as citizens or human beings. Enslaved people could not legally marry. They were barred from learning to read, restricted from meeting privately in groups. They had no claim to their children, who could be bought, sold, and traded away from them on auction blocks alongside furniture and cattle behind storefronts that advertised Negroes for sale. There's 3-day-old infants on the market recorded. There's thousands and thousands of children under 10 years old on the market in the fields of rice fields of Carolina, tobacco plantations, the boiling sugar refineries. Cotton was king. It was on the cotton fields too. Enslavers and the courts did not honor kinship ties to mothers, siblings, cousins. In most courts, they had no legal standard. Enslavers could rape or murder their property without any legal consequence. Enslaved people could own nothing, will nothing, and inherit nothing. They were legally tortured, including by those working for Thomas Jefferson himself. They could be worked to death, and they often were, in order to produce the highest profit for the white people who owned them. You know, slaves in the Caribbean versus slaves in America. I don't have that in my paper, but in within my research, I found out they were just dying. They were dropping like flies in the island, and they just had to keep shipping people from Africa to keep up with the demand of slave labor. Forced labor camps. I heard that quoted when they were talking about George Washington or Thomas Jefferson's workhouse. Forced labor camps. This is in our history books, people. They just only have 20 pages about slavery out of an 800-page textbook. It's like 5% or something. As horrible as slavery was, the first person to give his life for the American Revolutionary War was a black man. According to the U.S. National Archives and Records Administration, roughly 179,000 black men served as soldiers and another 19,000 served in the Navy during the Civil War. Black soldiers served in artillery and infantry and performed all non-combat support functions that sustained the Army as well. Black carpenters, chaplains, cooks, guards, laborers, nurses, scouts, spies, steamboat pilots, surgeons, and teamsters also contributed to the war cause. There were nearly 80 black commissioned officers, black women who could not formally join the Army, nevertheless served as nurses, spies, and scouts. The most famous being Harriet Tubman, who was scouted for the 2D South Carolina Volunteers. The National Archives say nearly 40,000 black soldiers died over the course of the war, but 30,000 of them died of infection and disease. And to go off of my paper, they were quarantined. They knew about disease at the time. They didn't know about disease specifically at the time, but they knew that poor health and sanitation leads to sickness, and they just didn't give blacks the right doctors or nothing, man. It's just, oh my goodness. After Abraham Lincoln died, President Johnson, a man who owned about 6 slaves himself until after the Civil War, gave the land right back to the same plantation owners who started. Black people who received reparations didn't even spend 365 days on the land. Blacks would be forced to work by law on these southern plantations, contracted through debt peonage or convict labor until after the Civil Rights Movement, around 60 years ago. According to Peter Stern's reference in the Oxford Encyclopedia of the Modern World, the U.S. Supreme Court banned peonage under the 13th Amendment, but the practice nevertheless persisted in the rural South, at least through the 1950s. There, planters used to keep sharecroppers in thrall, aided by the local sheriff. Ta-Nehisi Coates, in a historical piece for The Atlantic, The Case for Reparations, says a spinach picker fled Mississippi in 1963 after being made to work at gunpoint. It's tragic to know debt peonage lasted until the 1960s. What's worse, NBC headlines November 8th, 2019 reads, White South Carolina restaurant manager who enslaved, tortured a black worker finally gets his sentencing. When will the torture end? Discontent, discomfort, and the deaths of innocent lives would trigger the Great Migration of African Americans from the South in the 1930s. At the same time, the federal HOLC began redlining the neighborhoods. By the 1960s, the southern black population was cut in half. Millions of African Americans fled Jim Crow in the South, only to be pinned down in the ghettos of the North. From the 1930s to the 1960s, federal agencies, along with the shiesty real estate industry, furthered blacks' persecution and discrimination. Isabel Wilkerson wrote for the Smithsonian, when millions of African Americans fled the South in search for a better life, they remade the nation in ways that are still being felt. The positive outcomes of migration are vibrantly visible. It's the multifaceted, integrated society we have today. On the other hand, negatively, the effects are being felt as well. Those who had hoped to escape a terrible fate predestined by Jim Crow would only soon find a similar fate awaited. Wilkerson says the people who migrated would become the forebearers of most African Americans born North and West. Many of those people and their children and their children's children had been trapped in a government-designed hell. White mobs infused with violence and racial terror would keep blacks pinned down in the ghettos for decades. Coates discloses some of the dark history in his piece, The Case for Reparations. Whites colluded to pin blacks into the ghettos. There, they were overcrowded, overcharged, and undereducated. Businesses discriminated against them, awarding them the worst jobs and the worst wages. Police brutalized them in the streets. I quote, and Coates quotes, the pattern of terrorism is easily discernible, concluding a Chicago civic group in the 1940s. 1940s, let me repeat that. The pattern of terrorism is easily discernible, concluded a Chicago civic group in the 1940s. On July 1st and 2nd, 1946, a mob of thousands assembled in Chicago's Park Manor neighborhood, hoping to eject a black doctor who'd recently moved in. The mob pelted the house with rocks and then set the garage on fire. The doctor then moved away. I would too. In 1947, after black veterans moved into the Fernwood section of Chicago, 3 nights of rioting broke out. Gangs of whites yanked blacks off streetcars and beat the crap out of them. 2 years later, when a union meeting attended by blacks in Inglewood triggered rumors that a home was being sold to niggas, blacks blacks and whites thought to be sympathetic to those blacks were beaten in the streets. In 1951, thousands of whites in Sincero, 20 minutes or so west of downtown Chicago, attacked a whole entire apartment building that housed one single black family, throwing bricks and fire bombs through windows, setting the whole entire apartment building on fire. A Cook County grand jury declined all charges to the rioters. Instead, he indicted the family's NAACP attorney, the apartment's white owner, the owner's attorney, and their rental agent, charging them with conspiracy to lower property values. This is the government. They rioters, white mobs infused with violence and racial terror, just threw fire bombs at an apartment building, and now they're getting charged with a Cook County grand jury charges them with conspiracy to lower property values? This is America, people. We need to find this stuff out. 2 years after that, white people picketed and planted explosions in South Deering, about 30 minutes from downtown Chicago, to force blacks out. This is ridiculous. This excerpt from Coates is only a fraction of the nightmare African Americans lived through since the end of slavery. Unfortunately, African Americans have an even longer history of persecution by American Nazis, and many of the nation's modern-day ghettos that were crafted by the American government and prejudiced cooperators were crafted during times of extreme discrimination and racial terror. The negative effects of discrimination linger all around us today. Wilkerson says the Great Migration would expose the racial divisions and disparities that in many ways continue to plague and dominate the nation's headlines today. From police killing of unarmed African American to mass incarceration. There is an eerie connection to the 1930 ghettos and over-policing today. I quote, "Where you live matters, statistically speaking, to mappingpoliceviolence.org. Police killed 1,147 unarmed people in 2017. Black people were 25% of those killed, despite being only 13% of the population. There were only 23 days in 2018 where police did not kill somebody. In 2015, police killed at least 104 unarmed black people. The modern day patterns of African Americans' mistreatment are frightfully similar, if not worse, to the Jim Crow era. Annalise Morelli, writing for Courts, tells us in 1892, during the worst year of Jim Crow, 161 black Americans were lynched. In 2015, 258 black people were killed by U.S. police. For 2016, the trend seems similar. As of July, U.S. police have shot dead 509 people, 123 whom were black. These are people's lives we're talking about here. This is not just ink on a paper. Why are police prone to attack African Americans? Could it be connected to the police brutality from the past that Coates mentioned in his article? Brian Stevenson may have the answer in yet another informative piece from the New York Times and the 1619 Project called "Slavery Gave America a Fear of Black People and a Taste for Violent Punishment. Both still define our criminal justice system today." And I quote Stevenson, "The United States has the highest rate of incarceration of any nation on earth. We represent 4% of the planet's population, but 22% of its imprisoned. In the early 1970s, our prisons held fewer than 300,000 people. Since then, the number has grown to more than 2.2 million, with 4.5 million more on probation or parole. Stevenson says, because of mandatory sentencing and three-strike laws, I found myself representing my clients sentenced with life without parole for stealing a bicycle or for a simple possession of marijuana. Central to this understanding is the practice of mass incarceration and excessive punishment as a legacy of slavery. This appetite for harsh punishment has echoed across the decades late into the 20th century. Amidst protests over civil rights and inequality, a new politics of fear and anger would emerge. Stevenson continues, Nixon's war on drugs, mandatory minimum sentences, three-strike laws, children tried as adults, broken window policies, all these policies were not expressly racialized as black codes or Jim Crow segregation, but their implementation has been essentially the same. Stevenson says, it is the black and brown people who are disproportionately targeted, stopped, suspected, incarcerated, and shot by the police. I believe this excessive punishment and disproportionate treatment is a legacy of slavery as well. Stevenson tells us there are Louisiana children sentenced to life imprisonment without parole for non-homicidal offenses. Let me repeat this. Stevenson tells us Louisiana children sentenced to life imprisonment without parole for non-homicidal offenses, while mappingpoliceviolence.org tells us 99% of police killings from 2015 remain unconvicted of any charges for their homicide of unarmed civilians. The history of African American incarceration speaks volumes. Police may target and kill a majority of African Americans, but other people from different races are being murdered too. Police brutality affects us all now. The bodies are piling up, just as the Nazis piled them up for Hitler. But at least the Nazis were stopped and charged for their crimes. Who is going to stop them? Who will charge American Nazis for their crimes? It has to be us. We, the American people, collectively in conscious movements. Discrimination does not have dire consequences, does not only have dire consequences externally on African American communities. Internally, the stress from discrimination has been causing a major downfall in African American health. Linda Villarosa says for the New York Times, the poor health outcomes of black people, the targets of discrimination over hundreds of years and numerous generations, may be a harbinger for the future health of an increasingly diverse and unequal America. If we don't do something swiftly and efficiently to end discrimination, the consequences will continue to pile up. The United States National Library of Medicine National Institutes of Health found multiple biopsychosocial consequences of discrimination that lead to major health problems. The worst being infant mortality and heart disease. In their article, Transgenerational Consequences of Racial Discrimination for African American Health, they tell us, coupled with health problems caused by discrimination, is the biological memory of pain inherited from parents transgenerationally. They state the human body has a biological memory of early life exposure to harmful conditions that impact gene expression. The biological memory of racism and its encumbrances are passed down genetically affecting generations of families. This is not the first generation of African Americans afflicted with said ailments. The first ones afflicted must be the first ones to arrive over 500 years ago. Khalil G. Muhammad tells us in a piece for the 1619 Project that Christopher Columbus made his second voyage across the Atlantic Ocean in 1493, bringing sugar cane stalks with him from the slave-holding Spanish Canary Islands. His article has a befitting title. The sugar that saturates the American diet has a barbaric history as the white gold that fueled slavery. The extent of pain caused by American slavery is truly heartbreaking. This everlasting discrimination must come to an end. There is only one way to break all the curses ailing African Americans. We must fight for reparations. Reparations? The first thing most Americans think or say when it comes to the matter of reparations or any law tailored to black people is no. In less than 30 days, January 2020 will mark the 31st year U.S. Congress denies the bill called H.R. Forde, a bill simply proposing a study for reparations on U.S. slavery, not a penny for any actual reparations at all. According to statistics gathered in a 2011 study commissioned by the Opportunity Agenda, written by Janet D. Bell along with a profusion of scientists and professionals, state, there is no evidence white support for racial preferences has changed between 1988 and 2008. Conclusions were based on responses taken in 1988 and 2008 to questions such as, should the federal government take more active steps to address the unfair treatment of African Americans in the job market? In both years, roughly 90% of black people said, yeah, the government should help black people, and 50% of white people supported the idea alone. Information from this same study says, sadly, despite the widely held idea that racism has become socially unacceptable, large percentages of the population still harbor very traditionally prejudiced views. These large percentages of prejudiced people and views must decline if we are to get proper laws tailored to help. We must lower the prejudice in order to make laws to help and protect African Americans. We can no longer harbor these prejudiced views. Racism, prejudice, and discrimination must have no sanctuary, lest we become accessories to American Nazism. Knowing the origins of white privilege and black disadvantage can cure many social ills harming the world right now. In that 1963 interview, Malcolm X continued James Baldwin's foreboding message. Unless the government acts swiftly and energetically, future slaughter will make the bombing in Birmingham look like a dress rehearsal. Spike Lee's Black Klansman shows us one instance of this future slaughter present day. Based on a true story about a black officer infiltrating the Ku Klux Klan in their Grand Wizard in 1978, Spike Lee ends his film with terrifying live footage from August 11, 2017. The horrifying scenes show thousands of American neo-Nazis assembling for a white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. Spike Lee shows us exactly how racial terror is still active today. On August 12th, the next day, a neo-Nazi extremist viciously drove his car into an integrated crowd of people who were protesting their racial terror. Heather Hayes, a white woman, died at the scene as the murderer fled, continuing the bloody rampage. That day, that neo-Nazi injured more than 10 people, and left a woman dead. Ignorance is not bliss, nor will it be an excuse for idleness any longer. If we choose to look away or do nothing, we are accessories to the massacres of American Nazism. Ignorance forms something far more contrast than bliss. It forms blisters and bruises on society. We must act swiftly and energetically if we are to close the curtain on racism. The American people are just as guilty as the Germans were for watching this horror picture show. The urgency is pressing. End this racial nightmare and achieve our great country. Stop the slaughter that surrounds us. If not reparations, how can you repair the black nation? A heavy amount of research suggests without the enforcement of conscious government policies, there is little one person can do alone. Of course, there are exceptions. There are the modern day heroes that champion the cause. SB Nation reported LeBron James opened a school in Ohio, and then, before that, he promised over 1,000 kids their college tuition. The Inside Edition claims African-American billionaire Robert Smith just spent around $40 million to pay off class of 2019's entire student debt at Morehouse College. ABC tells us African-American veteran Moses West created a machine that pulls clean drinking water straight out of the sky. His water foundation is known for great positive change all over. His machine helps children around the world while teaching them about solar energy and how to maintain farms with hydroponics. These are strong examples of one-man armies putting a dent in the problem by repairing black communities and communities around the world. These great heroes, along with others I did not mention, are doing a lot. But technically, these great acts are simply band-aids over bullet holes compared to the accumulating desolation facing African American communities. We all aren't millionaires who can make great changes by signing a check. Trymaine Lee told us in his recent article for the New York Times of more horror stories and even more economic terror and wealth stripping that left the black people at lasting economic disadvantage. Lee informs us white Americans have 7 times the wealth of black Americans on average. Black people make up nearly 13% of the United States population, yet they hold less than 3% of the nation's total wealth. The median family wealth for white people is $171,000 compared with just $17,600 for the median wealth in black people. That's closer to something I could put my hands around, my mind around. Oh, you just want $1,000? Damn, I wish I should have $1,000. It's been so hard since I was born. It's been so hard. Oh my God. The Economic Policy Institute found 19% of black households have zero or negative net worth. Just 9% of white families are that poor. That's the ratio, you know what I mean? $171,000 for white people, $17,000 for black people. That means like the ratios are ridiculous. That's a disparity right there. How can the ones who need help the most make the greatest change if they're stuck in this cycle of deprivation? Fortunately, social media can be a powerful tool for any one person to make a change, white or black, rich or poor. With social media, anyone can make a change. Social media is classified as any technology that allows people to create and share content as well as participate in interactions with others. I recently found this information in a research assignment earlier this year. I wrote an essay called Social Media: Understanding Its Influence, Power, and Reach. After studying the political power of social media, written by Clay Shirky, I found social media has influenced many great changes. From Martin Luther using the printing press to protest the Catholic Church in the 1500s, stretching all the way to Martin Luther King Jr., using many different methods for his social media campaign in the 1960s. There is and always will be hope for anyone who wants to change this world into a better place. With social media, we are never completely powerless to change the world around us. And like I said, social media is classified as any technology that allows people to create, share, as well as participate in interactions. As long as we can interact and talk with each other, we can make a change for better. You know what I'm saying? When it comes to conscious and unconscious bias, as well as prejudice, first, there must be a willingness to change. If a person doesn't desire to change any racist ways, there are only few things that could make that person have a change of heart. Secondly, there needs to be more accurate media portrayals of African Americans. Scientists have confirmed that media creates rather than reflects negative understanding to the masses. And it's among the most important mechanisms for maintaining or changing these perceptions. Mass media has significant power to shape popular ideas and attitudes. This is quoted from scientists. Lastly, from the Opportunity Agenda, Janet Bell and the scientists from Opportunity Agenda. Lastly, a greater, more accurate understanding of the history of discrimination as well as the devastation is imperative. Scientists discovered a troubling link between the media's portrayal and lowered life chances for black males. Scientists have confirmed the media's negative portrayals form physical consequences in the day-to-day lives of African Americans. Scientists state there are many forces, material, historical, cultural, and political, that shape and constrict the chances of black males in the U.S. We cannot be one of them. Many researchers discuss how distorted portrayals can be expected to create problematic understandings, attitudes among audiences, including general antagonism towards black males, tolerance for race-based socio-economic disparities, exaggerated views related to criminality and violence, a lack of identification or sympathy for black males, reduced attention to structural as well as other big picture factors, and public support for punitive approaches to problems, is stated by Janet Bell, along with a profusion of scientists in the Opportunity Agenda. The lack of understanding and sympathy created by the media is detrimental to the lives of African Americans. These negative perceptions must be combated. Knowledge and understanding are known to lower bias. The Opportunity Agenda found a combination of explicit training about stereotypes plus exposure to a series of counter-stereotypical news stories have known to help reduce unconscious bias. The APS tells us integration and diversity also helps lower bias. They say it helps white Americans become more invested in the lives of people from different cultures. My hypothesis is if negative media creates negative perceptions and understandings while increasing bias, then a more positive, accurate media representation can lead to greater understandings while diminishing bias. I also believe my theory can be used similarly for history and the perceptions that follow that as well. The large gap in public knowledge in regard to American history creates similar negative understandings and perceptions of the African Americans. The grotesque history needs to be exposed if we are to combat this overwhelming bias. Hassan K. Jeffries, an associate professor of history, tells us we are committing educational malpractice. Social studies is largely absent from federal education, law, and policy. This crucial history, missing from public education, creates a wide array of negative understanding that adds to the negative perceptions created by the media, especially when it comes to the origins of racial disparities. Learning our history allows us to see the bigger picture, the causes of these disparities. People need to know how African Americans came to be in such a horrid predicament. We must trace the roots of these disparities, inform the masses, and aim for constructive regulations for African Americans. The broadcast of reparations alone would be enough to shatter the misconceptions surrounding African Americans and their disparities. Reparations would be official documentation from America for its crime and widely publicized through mass media and their outlets. Yahuwah Williams writes for the History Channel in the 2016, a study by the United Nations affiliate groups reported to the UN's High Commissioner on Human Rights and made non-binding recommendations that the history and continuing fallout of slavery justifies a U.S. commitment to reparations. This is the United Nations. Now is not the time for the UN's non-binding recommendations, political lip service, or empty promises. Now is the time for actions. Using the words of Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., this is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. In his speech, I Have a Dream, King declared, when the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this country. How many generations of black souls need to be born in desolation and discrimination and poverty before the cries of justice are answered? The Jewish community received billions in reparations from Germany for the sins of the Nazis. Susan Neiman for the Los Angeles Times exclaims in her article, Germany's efforts to face up to its murderously racist history are now seen as exemplary. But they didn't happen as a matter of course. Time, effort, and nearly endless debate were needed before the Germans were willing to confront the crimes of their fathers. Germany is diligently working to atone for the sins of their fathers, accepting the fact that its past government policies are responsible for the deaths of millions. While the U.S. Congress denies Bill H.R. Forde, a study for reparations, for decades. It seems America is still trapped in backward thought. Our public schools aren't even required to teach America's murderously racist history. Yes, the main part about this is how to diminish, let me get back to my thesis. How to diminish, the title is, if not reparations, how can you repair the black nation? By learning and spreading knowledge, dropping bias, taking care of people, treating people like people. African American health has never been equal to white American health ever in this country. From 1865 to 2019, we have serious health problems. My grandpa died of health problems. My great-grandma just died of cancer. These problems should not be afflicting these black people at such young ages. It's such a shame. It's such a shame to find out racism. Why we feel racism harder than any other race is because it's transgenerationally passed down through a biological memory from our parents. Our parents were whipped, our grandparents were whipped, and we feel that pain today. There needs to be reparations to help us out. to stop that, to put a dent in that, to diminish, to turn the flames down on that pain. But yes, don't worry, we got your back, black people. You were quintessential to America. Essential, quintessential, the perfect Americans. Justice and equality for all. America's founding ideals weren't true when they were written by our founding fathers. Black Americans fought to make them true. That's the name of one of my articles in here. I'm going to send this paper out to as many people as I can. Please share, please subscribe. I've got a lot of fun videos. I do a lot of fun stuff. I've got a lot more to say, but not about this. This will be in a book that I'm writing. After I write my comic book. After I write my graphic comic book superhero novel called The Deluge of Time, the Fourth Chronicle of Justice. There is justice in the deluge of time. I will bring it about. I love everybody. All power to all the people, to quote Black's Klansmen. Y'all doing the thing out there. Bless. I'm saying.